Hey everyone, welcome to What Could Go Wrong Live. I'm hanging out today with Thom Markham, and we are going to be talking about pretty much how we're just going to save the world with project-based learning. Is that about right, Thom? I feel like that's a good statement, yeah?
Yeah, that's a light topic you've chosen for today, Chelsea. We'll see what we can do about that one.
I wanted to keep it general, fun, easy, those types of things. So Thom is pretty cool. He's the founder of PBL Global, which PBL stands for project-based learning for all y'all out there who may not know what we're talking about. And he does some really cool things. As I had done some research into you before I reached out to you about coming on the show. And then once you agreed to come on, and it was super exciting. And then I researched you some more, and you do some really cool things, a lot of even global work with PBL and then local as well. So I'd love for you to tell us more about who you are and what you do.
Well, I've been involved with project-based learning for 20 years or so. I was maybe even a little bit longer at this point, but I was one of those who was early into PBL, practicing PBL, actually in the late 90s when I was teaching high school, and introduced myself to project-based learning, and then began to, after I left teaching, to do work with teachers directly on project-based learning. And during that time, some interesting developments along the way. One is I have certainly deepened my understanding of project-based learning, partly by my own research, but I've also worked with like 6,000 teachers, and I've been to 400 schools. And so it's a sort of a communal journey, if you will. I've learned a lot from all those teachers and those schools in different situations, different subjects, different kinds of students, different kinds of environments. So it's given me a really good base of knowledge and experience now that is really helpful when I'm working with teachers, which I still do in coaching schools. The other interesting thing is that it's really gone global, which is why about 4 or 5 years ago, I moved from being sort of just a Thom Markham consultant to PBL Global as an organization, which isn't really a huge organization. It's basically me and a network of people. Yeah. But I discovered as I was traveling different places like Australia or China or the Middle East, or I went to Malaysia, I've been to a lot of different places doing PBL. It became clear that the conversation around the future of education is virtually identical globally. The global conversation is identical. Now, teachers who are thinking about the future of education are thinking in the same direction. They have the same observations, the same complaints, if you will, and they have the same ideas on how we can break through and do something different and transform education. And that conversation always settled on project-based learning, but I use project-based learning in a rather broad way. I don't use it as a specific method or strategy, which it can be, but as a philosophy of teaching and learning. And the philosophy of teaching and learning is really the one that might apply to our topic today, saving the world, because PBL as practice in schools is not going to save the world.
Right.
PBL as a mindset is going to go a long ways towards solving the problems of the world. Yeah. So I've always embraced it as a mindset and a philosophy. And more, that means that PBL has been enriched by inquiry, design thinking, social emotional learning, which is a big topic that I incorporate into PBL. We can talk about that in a moment. That's important. And it's not just a classroom-based method. It's a way to move education out of the classroom and deal with, as we like to say, authentic, relevant, meaningful community issues. And I think if you look at the future of PBL, or the future of education in general. I think more and more we're going to be talking about sustainable development and less about quadratic equations. We're just in the midst of having to get after some of these life-threatening issues in our communities, and students and young people, I think, are anxious to do that, and PBL is a way to offer them that opportunity.
I agree. And when I was introducing the episode, I talked about, one of the foundational things of education to move education forward is a mindset, right? Coming at it with this mindset. And you touched on that, right? The difference between PBL as a practice and PBL as a mindset. Would you explain a little bit more about how they kind of complement each other or how they differ?
Yeah, they both complement and are different. First of all, one of the great things about project-based learning, from my standpoint, is that it gives you, the teacher, a Monday morning way to do something different in the classroom by posing a question, a challenge, having students investigate, inquiry, collaborate through teams, draft and design, come up with solutions that they can share and offer to an audience, which is the heart of the PBL method. So PBL as a method is well enough developed so that you can actually know what to do, as opposed to just, I'm going to save the world doing something in my classroom. It gives you a good, very good set of best practices and a structure to work from. So that's important to think of it as a method and to value it as a method, but it's always enhanced when you have a philosophical backdrop as to why you're doing it. And when you have that philosophical backdrop, which is really the mindset that you're referring to, that mindset sort of opens you up to work with your students to take on more authentic challenges and to really kind of push towards a really meaningful learning. And so that's when it kind of becomes a philosophy. So you really can't disentangle the methods from the philosophy. Sort of both sides of the same coin. But if I had to choose, I say it's much more important that you have the philosophy. But the philosophy without the method is just philosophy, which is just a lot of talk.
Yeah. You got to have both. I mean, so you talked about having meaningful learning. Can you tell us more about what is the difference between meaningful learning and passive learning? How does that look different inside of a classroom or for a learner or for a teacher in general?
Well, that's a big question because we throw around the term authentic and relevant, and with sometimes not really examining that. And there's arguments to be made in different ways. I mean, a math teacher can say, well, I just made fun of quadratic equations, which will probably get some math pushback on the chat board, but I don't really mean that. I mean, because knowing quadratic equations is very valuable for certain professions, and it really starts you into algorithms and learning technology and so forth. So I'm not trying to diminish that. So somebody could make the argument and say, well, of course, that's extremely relevant. So I don't disagree with that. But if we're looking at relevancy from the standpoint of where we are now in the world, which from my standpoint puts us pretty much on the brink of survival or not. In other words, it's a serious, serious moment. And we're just beginning to accept the seriousness of the moment, which means that we need to turn, we've got about, something like, 1.3 billion young people under the age of 18 on this planet. And that's a big reservoir of talent and expertise and imagination and creativity. And we just have to figure out how to match up that expertise and commitment and motivation with the needs of the day. And that's what PBL can do. And that's what I mean by relevant. Now, relevant doesn't mean you always have to have PBL that's focused on solving the problem of climate change. It might be the potholes outside your house and the road. In other words, there's a lot of different things that young people can be organized to do. And that's one reason that we're seeing more and more that schooling to some extent is moving outside the classroom. Even teachers inside the classroom are trying to do things that relate to the outside world, which of course is one of the principles of project-based learning. So, and one thing we've seen in the pandemic with a lot of virtual learning is passion projects that are almost totally outside the classroom and not only
Mm-hmm.
quite effective, but quite engaging for students. So we've learned a lot
Yeah.
about that in the past year.
Yeah, which is a great picture of meaningful learning when they have that curious drive behind what they're doing, brings them to a whole different level of engagement and learning, and then the outcome for the learner in that sense. So if you were to identify, what would be some identifiers of a PBL mindset? If you were going to see someone and you're like, ooh, they have kind of these identifiers that show that they have this mindset that will help move education forward or outside of the classroom, what would some of those identifiers be?
Well, the first identifier would be what psychologists, and I am a psychologist, what they would call openness to experience,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the big 5 personality attributes, which I don't put complete faith in, but it does begin to describe one aspect of our personalities and how our minds work. And that is flexibility and openness and humility and empathy and a lot of those qualities that will allow you to do 2 things, really. One is to enter into a more harmonious facilitator relationship with your students. So you don't have to be the sage anymore, and you don't have to be the
Right.
person who knows everything. You're there sharing the learning journey, which
Yeah.
really is an attitude that helps when you're facilitating PBL and you're a teacher, a PBL teacher. And the other thing is having the openness to understand that curriculum alone is too narrow to get at many of these issues, and you have to have a certain flexibility with curriculum so that you're not following it simply as a rote enterprise. For
Right.
example, pacing guides and PBL is like oil and water. They don't mix
Yeah.
well. They
Yeah.
just don't mix well. Um, you've got to be a little more creative. It actually, one of the things that's a bit under-recognized, and I see a question on the chat board, how do you train people to do PBL?
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges is it's not a direct experience that a teacher has. It really requires them to sort of operate as a creative person in the classroom,
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
someone who's just following a pattern or a curriculum. If you
Yeah.
do that, you miss the opportunity and you miss the energy of PBL. So that's what I mean by openness also. The openness to take the curriculum, which contains, at least in some ways, a lot of knowledge that we need, but being able to
Mm-hmm.
view it through a creative lens and figure out, well, when does that apply and when does it not apply? So rather than just a blanket, I'm going to teach this, this, and this,
Right.
focus on this and help students learn that so they'll be able to solve problems. So it's a creative exercise as a PBL teacher. And that's very difficult to train for. As a matter of fact, I never
Right.
use the word training. Training is what you can do. That's an industrial term in a way. We train people to do a certain specific job. But PBL, like so many complex professions in the world today, is not a specific job.
Right.
It's a variety of roles that you have to move through, and it requires an agility in your personality and knowing when to do things. So it's difficult to prepare teachers for PBL. And if you want, I can say a little bit more as we go on about how I would do that or what I think is important, because it's a critical issue right now because we're having trouble with PBL. There's a lot of bad PBL out there right now.
Yeah. 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 Because it's elusive, like you were saying. I mean, it's not just here are the standards and practices that you follow. It's a mindset, it's a framework, and it requires autonomy and creativity inside of that, which in some ways is completely opposite of traditional education as far as those pieces. So it is very challenging just to implement it from the very beginning. Like, where would you even start?
Yeah, and it runs against the grain of how schools of education operate, and which are really because they're still mostly reflective of this industrial mindset where things are done in logical sequence and logical order. Well, PBL isn't always logical. It's not like that. And so, yeah, it's interesting. It's difficult to prepare. So the way I do it and what I think is important, first of all, you need a knowledge base. And so I always recommend, what you got to know best practices, because best practices are what distinguish PBL from just old style projects. which is
Right.
just students getting out of their seat and doing something fun and engaging in groups and sort of a doing thing. But project-based
Right.
learning really originated, like not with John Dewey and the project stuff. It really originated with problem-based learning in the 60s. And it's important to remember there's always a problem at the heart of a good project, and engaging that problem is what you're looking for students to do. And that's where having this best practices approach allows you to focus on the problem, or the driving question, as we call it, understand the challenge, and work through a series of methods that allow you to get to a solution in a kind of a structured, organized way. So that's good. But there's theory and then there's practice, and there's quite a divergence between the two in PBL. So the practice is where you learn through experience, where you make some mistakes, you sort of search for the right way, and usually that takes a few projects to sort of get to the point where you feel more comfortable. And it's very helpful if you have colleagues to talk with. So it's kind of a group activity. It takes a lot of conversation to help people sort of get to the level of being a competent project-based learning teacher. Now, I see a question from Christina there. Is it difficult because flexibility is a must? Yeah, it is. I would say yes, it is, because if you're not flexible, you're going to be frustrated as a teacher, because if you're going to deal with human beings, you have to be flexible. If you're not flexible and you're dealing with human beings, you end up either frustrating yourself or people are very frustrated with you. And so that flexibility is something that is sort of built into the process and really makes life much easier for the teacher. And I just say that when teachers are flexible and they do feel they have some creative license in their schools and they have this freedom, then teaching through PBL becomes highly rewarding. And you don't hear any of this whining and complaining about how awful teaching is and I'm not paid enough. And, you just don't hear it. It takes away all that. It really does, because it's a very engaging, satisfying profession when you do it that way. Right.
Yeah. We had another question from Laura. What are your thoughts on the role that teacher preparation programs have in addressing the current educational climate?
Well, let's see. The thoughts that I'm allowed to give voice to on the broadcast are these. They got to get with it. They just got to get with it. They're still teaching old industrial kinds of methodologies and mindset. So I just was on a discussion a couple of days ago on the difference between classroom management and people management, because in the old days, you got 30 kids in a class, and the idea is to manage your classroom. And that we've got, textbooks and books full of ideas on how you do your bell ringers and you get everybody settled down, and there's all that. But in PBL, you're up close and personal. It really is a way to differentiate your instruction and differentiate learning. So it requires this facilitator role. And one of my complaints has been that we've done a very poor job of actually defining what it means to be a facilitator and a guide on the side versus the sage on the stage. We've been preaching it for like a long time, but nobody bothers to define it, because it requires a subset of very critical skills like observation, effective listening, active listening, your ability to read students and young people, your ability to withhold judgment. These are all pretty deep qualities. So I say, when you have students working in teams in a project, you're going to see their native behavior show up in ways that it won't show up when they're sitting in rows in the classroom. If you've got your eyeballs on them and you can see everything that's happening and they know you're watching, so they're much more secretive about their behavior. But when they're in groups, they don't become so secretive and their behavior comes out. And so you have a choice at that point as a facilitator to allow yourself to be highly annoyed that these students are disrupting the lesson, which of course sometimes they do. I mean, I know what it's like. Or you can really adopt the best habits and practices of a good facilitator, which is take a deep breath and try to figure out what's going on with them and really say, okay, now that I've seen this behavior, great. I welcome the opportunity to have the opportunity to coach them on this behavior. So you start to get to key behaviors that you're really trying to look for. But that requires a fairly evolved human being and somebody who can handle that. And that's
and it requires a certain level of emotional
maturity.
intelligence from the teacher and that maturity in that sense. And you set up a couple things, which remind me of a couple things that I'm always throwing out there. Like behavior is a form of communication. Every behavior is a form of communication. So how are we communicating back with them and allowing them to communicate with us? And then the other thing, you're talking about the sage teacher and its role to facilitator. And I always talk about the ego of the educator, right? How are we setting aside the ego of the educator and coming alongside as a co-constructor instead of a, let me tell you how to do it and all of that. And there's two more questions. One of them I want to ask before I get to the other one. Laura asks, what do you mean by native behavior?
Yeah, looking at the screen, that's probably a politically incorrect word these days. So let me kind of like clarify that. What I mean is behavior that happens in your normal environment when people aren't watching you and judging you and evaluating you. What you do in the privacy of your home is different from what you do at your workplace, the way you act. And when you put people in groups and take them away from that structured classroom environment, they just start to act more normally. And normal means more variation in their behavior. And that's what I mean by that. And you're just going to see a wider range of behavior from your students, which is going to give you an opportunity to know them better and an opportunity to coach them. That's what I mean by native behavior.
Yeah, because if you're not allowing for the variances in behavior, then you're only able to engage with the student in one manner. Until you allow for these variances, you don't have the opportunities to engage with them at different states of being and those types of things. You're limiting your ability to get to know, build a relationship with that child.
Yeah, that's why another thing I should highlight is that as we discuss personalization and differentiation and neurodiversity and issues like that more and more, and become better at sort of engaging with those issues, PBL is a nice natural fit for that because you have an opportunity to do a lot of differentiation, individualization in your teaching, learning products. So it's actually a great way to do that. Matter of fact, just to probably something most people don't know, historically, around the year 2000, almost all the PBL that was going on started in alternative programs, not in mainstream high school or mainstream school. Started in alternative schools where teachers were searching for, how do I do this? And PBL was a good answer.
Yeah. And Laura makes a good point. We also have to consider the role of implicit bias in interpreting behavior, which is another, emotional maturity thing that teachers and facilitators need to have on top of all the others that are needed to engage with students in healthy ways. What are your thoughts on that one?
Well, for sure. I mean, Laura's, I think, exactly right. Because the range now, obviously, the range of your mature responses as a PBL teacher now have to include, whether you want to call it cultural sensitivity or cultural competence. I actually use a deeper term these days. I use the term cultural humility. And that is, it's a deeper term. It's a recognition that everyone in the world, regardless of where they come from, whatever their circumstances, whatever, all of them have value and something to offer. And you always approach them with that in mind and looking for that value. So that really,
I love that.
It's a very broad term, sort of view of cultural humility, but that's what I think we need in a global world. That's what we really need. Is it goes beyond tolerance. Tolerance is one thing. Acceptance is one thing, but putting that into practice and really recognize value, that's a different matter.
Christina asks, what are universities doing to help with this issue?
Well,
I think we were talking about teacher preparedness and training at the point of that question.
Yes, they operate in two ways, really. The traditional admission system, based on how many AP classes you've taken and so forth, is not really helpful to PBL because PBL is not really a test-driven or admissions-driven system. It's really a development system yourself. So that's not always compatible with what universities want. On the other hand, you can sense that universities are also going through some major changes in terms of for example, University of California, no longer requiring SATs. You can see that this system is breaking down, and also university folks are becoming far more aware that they need to personalize their own educational structure in order to retain students, which of course is becoming a major issue for them. So, I think they're adapting and seeing it. For example, almost all the freshman science classes at MIT are PBL based. So there's a lot of inroads into PBL, particularly at the freshman and sophomore levels. Now, university professors are not and don't tend to be as well trained in PBL as K-12 teachers, because K-12 is kind of, in terms of professional training around how to actually teach. The K-12 school system is far ahead of university system, which is always assumed because you have a PhD, you know how to teach, which obviously is not true. So, as most of us have sort of experienced. So, so that's a little bit of a problem. There could be a lot more PBL training at the university level, and at the college level, I think they really need that. So that's where they could help. And now I'll just say one more thing. Because PBL, when it's done well, really can mature students and help them become much more self-managing and self-sustaining as a learner. I mean, at its best, that's what PBL does. It actually delivers to universities the exact kind of graduate from high school that they want, that they keep preaching about.
Yeah, right.
So it actually, I think many universities recognize that. And as we move more towards portfolios and ways in which we're capturing performance in high school at the K-12 level through PBL, more and more universities will start to accept that.
Yeah. So here's the kind of additional piece of that. But how are universities preparing new teachers? I see that as a big problem. If we learn PBL only as a framework, then is it just like every other framework?
Well, I think oftentimes it is just treated as any other framework, and that comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what PBL is. So this is where the teacher training industry needs to step it up, in my view. They don't actually understand PBL, and they don't understand. They can talk about it, but it's like relates to another question I see up here from Christina, which is standardized tests and the conflict with using PBL. We're in the midst of a transition now, and that transition is from an industrial system to a personalized inquiry challenge-based system. That's the broad historical sweep that's going on. It's actually happening pretty rapidly, and the pandemic accelerated the pace of that change, but the old standardized industrial system is breaking down. Now, you can cite me all sorts of instances and say, well, it's not happening at my school, and that's true. But we're talking about broadly what the trend is, and the trend is to break that down. And the more we do that, then you have to have some sort of replacement system, and PBL is the one that is really part of that. So that's the answer to Christina's question. Yeah, if all you're doing is spending your time 7 periods a day getting your students ready for standardized tests in late May, there is no time to do PBL. Christina's right, there isn't. So the only answer is to break that system. Now, it's not one hammer blow that breaks it apart. It's just, it's thousands of teachers chipping away at the system and thousands of administrators chipping away, and it's happening. Now, I believe, and I could get some pushback on this, teachers need to be much stronger about this as well, because oftentimes teachers, I think, are far too accepting of the system they're working in. I'd like to see them become a little more rebellious.
Yeah. What would that look like? Tell me what a rebellious teacher
for money
would
or
like.
time or benefits.
Right.
Rebellious against what they're forced to do as teachers.
Yeah. So tell me more about that. Like, what would that positive rebellion look like?
Well, I think it looks like having school-wide discussions about what we need to do in order to forward our school into the 21st century, meaning a lot more PBL and inquiry, meaning less curriculum, more inquiry, more sort of challenge-based work, more authentic work in all of our subjects, and breaking down some of these old stereotypes that certain subjects you can't do PBL in, like math, or math is usually the usual suspect.
Right.
And also getting better at deciding, well, what do we want to teach through our normal sort of delivery methods, and what should we be teaching through inquiry and student-centered objectives? So we hear about this word, phrase student-centered, and schools are becoming more student-centered, but we continue to bump up against the old requirements and the old mindset of it's about stuffing our head with the maximum amount of curriculum in order to do well to get into the university. And once we get into the university, everything will be fine, and then we'll graduate and we'll get a good job and things will be fine. Now, the workforce people will tell you that's not true, because they're very happy with the quality of people they're getting sent. So they're getting a generation of test takers, but they're not getting necessarily a generation of doers and entrepreneurs. But if you look at Chelsea, if you look at the whole system, you see that people are going outside the university system. They're starting to talk about technical training. They're starting about alternative pathways. You know, things are in ferment.
Yeah.
Things are in ferment. Yep.
Yeah, I agree. Quickly, like my daughter was at a school called Galileo, and it was learner-centered, facilitator run. And they essentially, she, even at 11, when she was going to this school, was just a community of learners, and they built their own schedule and then were able to switch and change. And she was doing things like coding and business development and creating clubs and those types of things. And it was just cool to see it, even in a digital space, able to pieces of this PBL concept coming out. So Christina pulls us back in and says, it's very scary because there are fewer and fewer people enrolling in education. And many of the teachers that are in front of the students are not even traditional. They are bad teachers, which I would say that defining a teacher as good or bad requires a lot of judgment on our part and what they were, the tools that they are given. So personally, I differ from the use of those types of labels, but I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not quite as alarmed by that as Christina might be. The reason is this: I don't think if all we have, let's say we double the salaries of teachers suddenly, national mandate in the U.S., and every teacher started out at $80,000 a year and automatically in year 3 went to $150,000 a year. Well, we get a lot of people enrolling as teachers. But if all we're going to do is teach them to be traditional teachers delivering traditional curriculum, they're not going to help the world. They might have a better lifestyle, but they're not going to help the world. So I think having a bit of ferment chaos right now is okay, because out of the chaos will come better solutions. I agree. Now, and I realize it's a little tricky right now, and it's hard for parents. It's tricky time. I don't want to dismiss that, but we are in the mid. When you have this kind of disarray, out of it will come more creative solutions, and there are creative solutions surfacing all over the place.
I have seen so many just in my, small circle. And what's interesting is people are pulling what you kind of, at the beginning, you talked about this, this need for education change, and the problems that we're seeing are the same globally. And I want to kind of run back to that in this sense that I've seen it even in my small circle, right? These pieces are being pulled from all different types of structures and learning styles, to meet the needs of the students. There's not a one size fits all. There's not this is the structure you need to serve everyone. And that's one thing I love about PBL is it's, differentiated in that manner. And so I'd love to hear more about kind of your experience and what you've seen globally, and expand on everyone's experiencing the same issues. We're all hitting the same obstacles and roadblocks in that sense. We're together in that way.
Yeah, it's generally not recognized by the media that there is this sort of global movement. But the factors are the same, Chelsea. They're First of all, teachers are working in rigid systems, and they all, I shouldn't say all, but the teachers who are thinking about this, some teachers accept the rigid system, but teachers who are thinking, well, we need something different, are seeing that this rigid system simply puts handcuffs on kids and doesn't engage them in that deeper motivation. So they're all seeing the same thing. Kids attending, doing some work, going home, but not having their lives changed and not really being educated in the sense that we might think about it in a deep way. They're all concerned about the standardized curriculum. It's too much. I mean, I just did a webinar with Pakistani teachers on Saturday, and same complaints, same exact complaints. And China, I work with a lot of Chinese teachers, same complaints. And so it's that standardized curriculum backed by high stakes testing is just a killer right now. It just doesn't fit with the times and with what young people need to do to develop themselves internally, attitudinally, in order to be ready to engage this world that's out there, whether it's work or life.
It's missing that holistic piece. The holistic, we need to serve the whole child.
Piece because it is a holistic world, and that's how people operate these days. And our system of preparation is out of sync with the society that we're putting people into. That's the main reason why PBL is becoming popular.
Yeah. Laura asked, to what extent does PBL involve parents and families in teaching and learning?
Well, it should. That's a good question, Laura. It really should involve them much more. That's something that I preach a lot when I'm working with schools, particularly schools that are trying to do a whole school shift to PBL or more PBL, not to become a PBL school, which I don't really recommend, but to incorporate much more PBL into their curriculum. They really have to bring along their community and educate their community, because parents, as all, I bet everyone who's on the broadcast now understands this. Parents really went to school, one kind of school. It's hard for them to understand a new kind of school. And so parents have a natural fear that you don't want your child to be experimented on. So they need to have some, you need to have some. So the way you do that is the best schools I've seen have really strong parent involvement that goes far beyond the bake sale or the PTA mentality. They involve parents in watching expositions and presentations and learning, opportunity to ask questions of the kids. What'd you learn? What'd you get out of this? What was your favorite thing? And the kids engaging their parents. So I think I like to use the term that as we move into this new world out there, whatever this new world is, it's brand new to everybody, whether you're 8 years old or 80 years old. And so we're really engaging as co-learners. And so that requires a sense of community where we're sharing with each other, what do we want to learn? And you asked about the voices of the learning world earlier before we went on the broadcast. That was the idea I had a year ago. What do people want to learn in the world? We need to free up this whole conversation and take it out of the walls of the classroom, beyond the textbooks, outside the frameworks, as we say. There's something we need a little more freedom to do it.
I agree. And community is a huge part of that. And, to bring it full circle, it comes back to, you had mentioned parents, not wanting their kids to be experimented on, and the school looks different than it did when they were there. And it all comes back to us having a shared mindset and a shared understanding of why we're educating, what the end goals are, and that kind of thing. And I have a friend who's always making the comment that if as an adult, education or schooling looks what it looked like when you were in it, then it's probably being done wrong, which is, kind of a funny thing, but it's not all wrong, because it's been how many years since you were in school, and the world has changed so much. So how is school aligning to, these types of changes or keeping up with them?
Yeah, that's exactly the approach I take as well. I think about what I call the outcome really becoming what I call a project mindset. A project mindset means that you're engaged with the world, like Laura says, purpose-driven, maybe very familiar with sustainable development goals, good at collaborating, good at communicating, good at using adult resources, good at learning what you need to know and finding good teachers to get that core knowledge. And and also I also incorporated in that well-being and a strong sense of your own social and emotional strengths,
Yeah.
like curiosity, perseverance, creativity, all those kinds of inner qualities, which really help you these days to become, I don't like this term succeed in life, but to be stable in
Right.
life. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah. So though you need all those things, so it's a mindset. And I use the term project mindset because it's also the ability to go out and be entrepreneurial and creative and take action in a world that needs action, positive action.
Yeah. Yeah. In ways that may not be, condoned, if you will. Like they may be outside of the box. They maybe look crazy to people out, and they need to have that, the mindset, that growth mindset, I guess, to jump off that cliff and try something different that looks different than what people before them have done. And earlier, let's see, Christina made a comment that said, we all know that kids are not the future, teachers are. And so I asked her to expand on that. And she says, teachers are the ones leading the classroom. Students are learning from them. If we have teachers who are not stopping and addressing students' feelings, if teachers don't know about their students' background, then students are growing up not feeling important, which is true. We talked about that, having the teachers needing this level of maturity to be able to engage with their learners. And she goes on to say, mediocre teachers are guiding mediocre curriculums, and students are spending a huge amount of time with them in that environment. How is the world being led? Students are only the product of education.
It brings up a good question for what's required in project-based learning to be a good PBL teacher. So we talked about openness and flexibility, but also you have to know when to lead and when to follow. That's part of the flexibility. So there are times during a PBL project in which you have to know when to teach and what to teach in the role of a traditional teacher. So, and then you have to know when to let go and set up an environment when students can learn on their own. I just had a long discussion with an Australian teacher about this yesterday, and he was having trouble as his first project, knowing what to teach and when to let go. And we talked, and there is no one rule on it. It's sort of the knife's edge that every PBL teacher walks, but you get a better feel from it. And he said, well, what's the criteria? And I said, well, the criteria, and I sort of said this on the fly, I'm not sure how thoughtful it was, but when there are certain things that you, as a teacher, know that your students will have to know in order to succeed in the project, that's a good place to do some teaching, to lead. And when you have areas in which they're going to apply that information and do something with it, that's when you turn them loose. So that's sort of the criteria I use.
I like that. That's it's very challenging. And working in early education, that's my background, and leading a team of educators. And we were switching from a traditional education to Reggio Amelia philosophy, which carries some similar traits. And so that was a huge mindset shift of getting to that point. We ran into the same things. When do we help them? When do we not? When do we allow them to fail? When do we pick up the pieces for them? That conversation. And it just comes back to, understanding the end goal, understanding your learners, having a relationship with them. And there is no one answer, which can be very challenging for teachers and educators who have always been given, this is the answer, follow this script, just like this, and you'll get the answers to the standardized test. And so that autonomy and creativity can be very challenging for teachers.
And it becomes more challenging the higher you go to the secondary level. So if you have a Reggio Amelia approach or a Montessori approach, or these days play-based learning in grades 1 to 3 is very popular for PBL schools. All that is wonderful, but it's hard to incorporate that play-based mentality with 10th graders when you're trying to teach algebra or world history or something like that.
Right.
It becomes far more tricky, and that's where we're really going to have to give up some control and recognize that there's many different forms of knowledge. And I think what we're eventually headed for is we're going to have to decide sort of what is our cultural core of knowledge, which is probably around numeracy and literacy. And actually knowing things is going to be diverse, which is okay, because if you want to know about world history, you could probably watch 10 YouTube videos and be as well schooled as a year in a world history course.
It is. It's true. You're not wrong. I mean, I've had the same conversation regarding this ego of the educator I was talking about earlier, is we no longer hold the keys to all the information. I
Nope.
mean, learners can find information. If they want information, they don't have to go through us. And a lot of that, in my experience, and my thought on that is one of our roles is switching more from the giver of information rather to the, like you were saying, the facilitator of information, helping them filter through information. What is quality? What is not? What can be set aside? What can I keep? What aligns? That kind of thing. And that shifts some of our role as educators a lot, from we hold keys to you have everything, let's help you filter it.
It also elevates the role, Chelsea, to one that requires a more complex set of skills. And again, goes back to our theme of the day, which is a more mature teacher who's able to filter out information. So
Yeah.
you're no longer the conveyor belt. You're something else here, and it requires much more, sort of a more reflective personality, and someone who is actually PBL. This is true of PBL. You have to know your subject really well in PBL. It used to be sort of the assumption that, oh, the kids are doing all the work, so I don't need to know much. But in fact, in PBL, you're liable to get a question in week 3 of your project that you've never heard of before.
Oh,
and either
yeah.
you know the answer, or you say, I have no idea. I'll go look it up. We'll talk tomorrow. So it requires that kind of openness.
Yeah, let's find out together. So William says, if you change education system, say in high school, after they've experienced the norm, how do you make that change so late? So I guess if they're coming from a traditional education and we're switching it out to PBL in higher ed, how does that feel like for the student?
Yeah, that's a really good question, William. I appreciate that, because that is a challenge. And this Australian school that I referenced just a bit ago is a good example. They're getting some pushback from students because the students have been involved in traditional education. Now the teachers are switching over to doing project-based work. And sometimes the project-based work is quite interesting and sometimes not. So the students are like, just give me the textbook. I'll be happy. I know how to do that. Tell me what the homework assignment is. I know how to do that. And of course, that's because we have trained them so well to do that. That's the adult training the students to do that. So you have to retrain. And that's a bit of a cultural shift. And what it requires from my standpoint, first of all, a pretty deep, frank, and serious and transparent discussion between the teacher and the students as to why we're doing this. And the arguments go somewhere along the line of, because this is the way the world works these days, because what we've done in the past is not really prepare you in the way you should. Because if we didn't do project-based work, I would not be doing my job as a teacher, which is to get you ready for the big world. And just sort of have a discussion like, we're in this together and we're trying, and you establish what I call that channel of trust. And you just say, we're in it together. That's the beginning part. And that's the beginning part. And then a lot of reflection and a lot of student questioning with honest answers by the teacher, including reflecting on projects and asking what didn't go well and what was I responsible for not going well in this project. So it requires
some humility.
Back to humility and openness, exactly.
Yeah, we definitely need some humility. Laura expands on that, goes back to the purpose and remembering to be mindful when interacting with students and responding to their needs in the moment. We have to drop our egos as much as possible, which is really hard.
Yeah, the ego thing is there. It's the ego being the teacher in the know, the person in the know, a control issue, all those kinds of sort of affiliated attitudes that come with that being in charge. So you have to let go of that. Frankly, it's hard to say who's in charge these days, particularly if you get a ninth grader who knows technology about 1,000 times better than you do.
This is true. That's true. And that's why so often I come back to, we should co-constructing together, right? The future of education is that we don't know the future of education. The future of the world is that we don't know the future of the world. So let's find it out together. Instead of me standing in front and say, I know all the answers, come and get them. It's me standing beside you and saying, let's find out the answers together, because the future is we don't know the future. And so if I were to take this conversation and wrap it up into some highly philosophical views, we know philosophy is nothing without action. But I want to kind of wrap it up for a second and say we've kind of discussed the needs for this human, this facilitator, to come alongside the learner and really understand them, engage with them, make the effort to, we talked about cultural humility, which I loved that concept, and giving up the reins a bit, understanding that we're building this together, we're finding those pieces together, letting go of all that control, right? So I think I've seen this mindset trickle over into other places. Like parenting is becoming more and more of this structure where we want to allow them to experience the work situation, especially with remote. Bosses are having to let go of some of these things. And so I think this mindset is becoming a lot larger than just in education.
Well, if you want to go into deep philosophy, which is, I guess, where we're going to kind of end up today, we're actually becoming far more of a communal world, and we are sharing and sharing and sharing. It's not just social media. We're becoming more communal. There's actually some very interesting research out there in social neuroscience about how our brains are actually responding to a communal culture and shifting. And so I believe that we're learning more and more about how to open up to one another and to share. And that means different ages opening up to different ages. And so that's what I hope will happen. And PBL is a really good way to foster that and support that kind of notion, because it is a very communal kind of teaching, either with your colleagues or you and your students, or the students and the students.
Yeah. Well, I've loved this conversation. I mean, I feel like we could just keep going and talk about the neuroscience of communal culture, because I just wrote that down. That sounds, we'll have to come back around to that in another conversation. But where can people find you, Thom? Like, how can they engage with you as we all continue learning about this?
Well, there's two ways to engage. Thom, I'm THOM at pblglobal.com. That's my email. You can stick that there up on the chat if you want. Thom at pblglobal.com. I'm happy to answer questions. Happy to, if your school's looking for work, that's how I make my living. So I'll make a little pitch there. I always love to do coaching, and it's very effective to do some coaching on PBL. If you're looking to get the basics on PBL, I've developed 3 courses online, and it's .com, Chelsea.
Yeah, I messed up. I'm gonna fix it. Go ahead.
That's right. It's 3 courses. If you go to pblglobal.com, you'll see how to get to the courses on Teachable. There's 3 courses. One is how to design projects. Second is how to facilitate projects. And the third is a change maker doing projects in a virtual environment. So all those courses, that's like 40 some modules that you can take, no charge. You can do it on your phone. And so it's a really good way to do what I call the PBL Global School, and it's free, no charge. So teach your small for doing it.
That's awesome.
It's a really good way to get started on PBL.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. So anybody who's watching this now, hanging out in the replay, his email is up on the screen. He's on LinkedIn. That's how I found him. You can find him on his website. But we're excited. I'm excited about what the chaos has brought, and now where we're kind of moving forward and seeing this change. So thank you so much for engaging in this conversation. I have taken all kinds of notes from what you've said, and I intend to Google some of these things because some of them are new to me. So I'm going to throw you off the screen for a quick second and wrap up. But thank you so much for hanging out with us, Thom.
Thank you, Chelsea.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for hanging out. This was a great discussion. Your questions, Christina, Laura, everybody who was engaging, really thank you. You brought such more insight to this conversation, and you really moved it for us and had some great points and insights that I didn't have written down in my list of questions. So thank you. I stream this with Restream because I don't know enough about how to make it go on all the channels. So Restream does that for me. So yay. Catch the next episode of What Could Go Wrong live next Wednesday, always at 4. And then all the previous episodes with everybody, all the cool educators I've been able to talk with on my YouTube channel. So thank you guys.